Hello, young fellows. Today I bring you a creepy but sad story. It is said that parents should never bury their children. It is not the natural order of things, but what would happen if, after death, you could still contact your child? Prepare yourself, dim the lights, and join me on this journey into the realm of terror. I am currently 30 years old and I am originally from a small town in Michigan. I lived my entire childhood here. I thought about leaving the town where I was born and raised, until I met my wife. Between the two of us, we managed to rent a small apartment, and as time went by, we moved to a larger apartment since we were already expecting our first child. At first, the apartment seemed to be quite comfortable. We lived a quiet life, but with the arrival of a child, everything changes. Fortunately, we managed to adapt very well. So the years passed, and what seemed to already be a stable and calm life, it fell out of our hands. My son was diagnosed with a blood disease. It should be noted that for a long time he looked very healthy, but from one moment to the next he became ill with leukemia, and not much could be done. I do not want to go into all the details because of how painful it was for us. He was a very happy child who always told us, "I just want to play a little more." We had the opportunity to be with him in the last moment of his life. At the age of 6, my son left us. They say that the most painful thing for a father or mother is having to bury their own children. I'm afraid that's true. After this, I understood that things would never be the same again. And no matter how much we attend therapy or take some medication to cope with depression, it is a wound that will never heal. You just have to learn to live with it. Months passed, and this is where things started to happen. At first, the apartment began to feel empty, and even though my wife and I were in it, there were gaps that were impossible to fill. You could feel a very heavy atmosphere in it, but especially in my son's room, we kept it closed. His things were intact, just as he had left them. One day, after returning from work, I found my wife crying on the couch. I approached her and gave her a hug. It had been 3 months since our loss, and when trying to console her, she told me, "I'm fine," except that as I passed by our son's room, I thought I heard him playing. I could hear his laugh and his voice. I knew that as a mother, it affected her more than me. Even though I was his father, the connection between mother and son is stronger. I always wanted to look strong for my wife. I asked her to tell me more about what she had heard. She told me that she didn't want to stay by the door for long because she came to think that her mind was playing a bad joke on her. I understood it. That same night, just before midnight, I got up to drink water. I had to pass by my son's room, so I stopped for a few seconds to listen, but nothing happened. Already in the kitchen while drinking water, I had the habit of looking out the window to take a look at the street. It was when I opened the blinds that I could see the reflection of a child watching me from behind. I immediately turned around and saw no one. I imagined that I still had the concern of what my wife had told me. I returned to bed, and just as I passed by his room, I stayed still for a moment, hoping to hear something, but nothing happened. I opened the door carefully. Everything was dark. The windows of the room had remained closed since the last day, so I turned on the light and confirmed that everything was in its place. The next morning, I told my wife what had happened. With the exception of the child's reflection, I didn't think it was wise, because for me it had been my imagination. But about the room, I reminded her that we lived in an apartment and that it was very likely that it was from one of the neighbors. She accepted my theory, and I could see how her expression changed again, becoming depressed. I thought that perhaps she had already figured that our son had returned to us. However, it was more difficult for my wife to come to terms with that idea because she told me how the event had happened again when I was working. While she was sitting watching television, she heard noises coming from the room. She approached the door and heard the laughter and voices of a child. She decided to go down to the neighbors quickly and make sure if the noise was coming from their apartment. But what would be her surprise that there was no one, so she ran to the apartment upstairs. Perhaps they had already rented it, and there was someone there. But when she knocked on the door, no one answered either. He returned to ours, ran to our son's room, and without making much noise, she put her ear close to the door to listen. She could hear murmurs, as if someone was speaking in a low voice. But these were the murmurs of a child playing in silence. She got so excited because she remembered when we scolded the child for screaming while playing, and then he lowered the volume of his voice so much that we could barely hear it. It was when I got home from work that I found my wife on the couch, but she was no longer crying. She was happy and had a smile that I had already forgotten she had. Of course, this worried me. I thought that perhaps she was already imagining things because the grief was still very recent. That night, while my wife served me coffee, she asked me to please leave the light on in the living room and also the one in the child's room. He was very afraid of the dark. I didn't want to argue or mention anything, and so I agreed. I don't know what happened that night that finally, after so long, I was able to sleep peacefully. Perhaps it was having seen my wife happy as before. The next morning, someone knocked on the door. It was my neighbor from the apartment below who, very annoyed, asked me if it was necessary for us to make so much noise and so late. My wife told her that we had gone to bed very early, to which the neighbor argued that someone was making noise in the middle of the night, as if someone were dragging toy cars on the floor. Again, we told her that it wasn't us, and while I apologized, my wife ran to our son's room. When we opened it, we could see how the toy cars were scattered on the floor. I imagined that some of them could have fallen off the shelf. "Don't you see it?" My wife told me. "Our son was here." This was already worrying me. I was looking for a more logical answer, but my wife was seeing something out of the ordinary. Something had to be done. I decided to call my mother-in-law and update her. For me, she was always a very strong and upright person. She asked me to take care of putting away her grandson's things while she invited my wife to stay with her for a few days. I didn't have objection. I had to do something for my wife's sake. I tried to look for boxes in the house. I only needed the packing tape, and when searching in the drawer where we had the household stationery, I found a medicine that caught my attention. A couple of months ago, my wife couldn't sleep, so the psychiatrist had prescribed pills, which relaxed her completely. She didn't finish them, in fact. I remembered that she had only taken one, but now there were 2 more missing. I imagined my wife adding those 2 pills to the coffee she had served me the day before. That's why I had slept so peacefully the other day, and it was she who had gotten up in the night to the child's room. I have to accept that thinking about this made me very uncomfortable. I trusted my wife, but I was worried about her health. While I was putting the drawer in its place, I dropped the medication on the floor and went under the couch in the living room. I approached, somewhat frustrated. I looked out from underneath, and I saw the medicine. I just had to put my hand in to take it, and just when I was touching it, I could feel that another hand squeezed me tightly. I got scared and quickly took my arm out. It was all in an instant when I heard someone laughing in the hallway and ran to my son's room, slamming the door. I had heard it well. It had been the laughter of a child. Clearly you could hear someone playing and laughing. This scared me quite a bit, and just as I was in front of my son's door, it slowly opened. A white marble passed under the door, reaching my feet. Something had pushed it from within. I didn't dare to stay there anymore. I quickly grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment. What had that been? It had all been so real that I still had goosebumps. I arrived at the house of a colleague from the office. I trusted him so much that I told him everything that happened. That's when he decided to recommend that I buy a dog or a cat. If it was something paranormal, the animal would scare it away and leave us alone. I had nothing to lose. I decided to return to the apartment with my wife. We got a dog, not very small, but of medium height. I didn't want to ask my wife about the pills, much less tell her what happened. However, when she questioned me about the dog, I told her that it was a recommendation from the psychiatrist to resume our lives taking care of another living being. However, what would be our surprise that when we arrived at the apartment, a notice from my neighbor was posted on the door. The note said, "In the most attentive way, I ask you to be silent at night. Otherwise, we will have to call the police." I had been out of the apartment for several days. Whatever was inside had made a lot of noise during our absence. I ended up telling my wife that I was moving some furniture. It was likely that the neighbor would have been upset about it. Upon entering the house, everything looked in order. However, my son's room was closed. I left the dog on the balcony. I would let him enter the house at night, in case something happened again. That night, while we were resting, I heard someone walking in the hallway. I thought it was the dog, but it was the footsteps of someone wearing shoes. Immediately afterwards, I heard someone bouncing a ball. I thought that the neighbors would come up with the police at any moment, so I got up quickly, and when I opened the door, I could see how someone threw a ball to the dog. Whatever it was still there. "I don't know who you are," I said to the complete darkness of the hallway, "but I need you to leave." I didn't receive a response. Everything was silent. I thought that it was finally gone. The dog saw me attentive. I didn't pay attention to him, and when I turned around to return to my bedroom, in front of me was a child. He had short hair. I couldn't see his eyes because they were two dark orbits. He opened his mouth and screamed several words, but the one I remember most was hearing him say, "Mom." That vanished in front of me. At that moment it was my wife who quickly left our bedroom. She asked me what was that. I told her that the noise was coming from the street. However, I was shaking. We went back to bed. I was feeling quite uneasy, so I asked my wife to hug me. Shortly after, I could hear someone walking around the bed. I started to think it was the dog. We had left the bedroom door open and the dog had gotten in, but again it was someone's footsteps. I felt something on my feet. Someone was touching them. I opened my eyes, and when I looked at the foot of my bed, I could see a child smiling at me. I was stunned. "Who are you?" I asked with a trembling voice. The child just smiled and vanished in front of my eyes. My wife woke up and found me crying. I realized that I had forgotten our son. I didn't accept that it was him, that maybe he just wanted to keep playing. That night, I cried as much as I haven't cried during my son's funeral. It pains me to say it, but the paranormal events became less and less. Every once in a while, when I get home from work, I bring a new toy and put it in the room. My wife already opened his room, letting the light in as well. And always at night we say goodbye to him, and we remind him not to play so late. I like to believe that somehow he answers me and listens to us. Until a couple of days ago, my wife told me something that surprised me. She asked me why I had put the sleeping pills in her bag. I just smiled, realizing I wasn't the only one who cared about her. Stories unfold around the world that are difficult to believe. These are situations that are out of the ordinary, which is why I wanted to tell you about the experience that I had with my wife and my son.